Emily had never imagined her life could change so dramatically in such a short span of time. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, the day she married Jack. They had been together for almost 3 years, and everything had felt perfect. Jack was kind, intelligent, and had an infectious sense of humor that always made her feel safe and loved. Their relationship had been steady, grounded in mutual respect, laughter, and a shared vision for the future. They were ready to take the next step. Their wedding had been a small, intimate affair. Emily had wanted something simple but beautiful. Just their closest friends and family in a cozy little venue by the beach. It wasn't extravagant, but it was everything they had dreamed of. The sea breeze was gentle, and the soft hum of the waves in the background felt almost like a promise of forever. They exchanged vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other. There had been no hints, no signs that anything could go wrong. Everything was perfect. After the ceremony, they had their first night as a married couple in a small cottage nearby. It felt surreal. Emily had never felt more in love, and Jack looked at her the same way. They spent hours talking, laughing, and just enjoying the quiet intimacy of the night. The next morning, they woke up early to watch the sunrise together. It was the kind of love that felt unshakable, the kind of love that everyone else looked at and envied. But then everything changed. Jack was gone by the time Emily returned from running a small errand that afternoon. She had stepped out for no more than 2 hours, leaving him alone in their little cottage. When she returned, she found the front door slightly ajar. She called out his name, expecting him to come into the living room, but there was no answer. A sudden chill ran down her spine as she walked through the cottage, looking for him. His clothes were gone. His wallet was gone. His phone was gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving only an eerie silence behind him. Emily tried to stay calm. She checked the house again, wondering if maybe he had gone for a walk or stepped outside to clear his mind. But the cottage was empty. She couldn't fathom what had happened, and panic began to rise in her chest. She tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She sent text messages, left voicemails, and even emailed him. There was no response. She returned to the small town they had been staying in, asking anyone if they had seen Jack. She went to the beach, the local cafe, and even to the nearby park, hoping someone had some clue as to where he might have gone. But nobody had seen him. It was as though he had disappeared without a trace. As the hours passed and night began to fall, Emily grew frantic. She couldn't understand what was happening. She called the police, desperate for answers. When the officers arrived, they were sympathetic but cautious. They took all the information she provided, asking if there had been any previous signs of Jack being upset or acting strangely. Emily tried to explain that there had been no issues, nothing that could have led to such a drastic decision. She tried to convince herself that he had just gone for a walk, or had some kind of temporary breakdown. But the nagging thought in the back of her mind told her that something was wrong. The police took a report and promised to look into it, though they were quick to tell her that it might just be a case of someone needing space after a significant life event. It's not uncommon for people to leave after a wedding, one officer had said. Sometimes they just need time to process the commitment. Emily, however, didn't believe that for a second. She knew Jack. He wouldn't do something like this. He wouldn't just disappear, especially after promising to spend the rest of his life with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next few days were a blur. The police conducted a search, but there was no trace of Jack. They checked his phone records, hoping to find some clue as to where he might have gone. But his phone had been turned off almost immediately after he left the cottage. There were no calls, no messages, no digital trail to follow. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. Emily was left alone, in a small town, confused and devastated. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their wedding day, Jack's smile, his eyes full of love and hope. How could someone who had made such a commitment just disappear without a word? The weeks that followed were no better. The police had no new leads. They questioned everyone they could, friends, family, neighbors, but nobody had seen or heard from Jack. The case began to grow cold. Emily tried to keep hope alive, but the longer he was gone, the more she felt like she was living in some kind of twisted nightmare. Her family and friends were supportive, of course, but they didn't understand. They tried to be kind, offering their condolences and words of comfort. But Emily couldn't help but feel more and more isolated. Her life had been turned upside down, and she didn't know how to make sense of it all. Jack was her everything, and now he was gone, without a trace. Months turned into years. As the search for Jack grew more distant, and the investigation stagnated, Emily had no choice but to move on. She couldn't afford to keep living in the past. She went back to work, trying to bury the pain and confusion beneath the surface. She tried dating, though each time she thought she was ready to open her heart again, she would find herself thinking about Jack, about the promise he had made, about their life together that would never be. There were moments when she thought she might never be able to love again. But eventually, she met someone new, Mark. Mark was kind, stable, and understanding. He didn't pressure her to forget Jack, and for that, she was grateful. Over time, their relationship grew stronger. Emily's heart began to heal, slowly but surely. But even with Mark's love and support, Emily could never fully escape the shadow of Jack's disappearance. She had nightmares. She wondered if he was still alive, if he was out there somewhere, thinking about her, regretting what he had done. But she had no answers, only endless questions. And so life went on. Emily became pregnant with Mark's child, and the promise of a new life filled her with a sense of peace. Even though the void Jack had left was still there, always present, always aching. She thought of Jack often, especially on their wedding anniversaries, but she had learned to accept that he was gone, and she had to move forward. But deep down, a part of her would always wonder what had happened to him, why he had disappeared without a word. Was he still alive? Was he out there somewhere? Or had something happened to him that she would never know? She tried to push these thoughts aside, focusing on the present, on the family she was building. But it was hard to forget someone who had meant so much to her. 15 years had passed, and yet Jack's disappearance still lingered in the corners of her mind, haunting her on the quiet nights when she was alone with her thoughts. Life, as it often does, carried on. But in Emily's heart, there was always a space reserved for the man who had once been her husband, and who, for reasons unknown, had disappeared from her life without a trace. 15 years had passed since Jack disappeared without a trace. The pain, though it had softened with time, never fully left Emily's heart. She often found herself staring into space, thinking back to their wedding day, to the man she had loved so fiercely, the man who had vanished from her life just hours after they had exchanged vows. The absence was still a constant companion in her life, lingering in the background of every major milestone, like a shadow that refused to fade away. Though she had rebuilt her life in many ways, something about the mystery of his disappearance kept pulling at her, like a thread she could never quite unravel. When Jack had disappeared, Emily was certain that she would never be able to move on. But life, as it often does, had a way of forcing her to adapt. Time didn't heal the wound, but it did dull the edges. After a year of grieving, Emily began to feel the subtle pull of life again. She returned to work, focusing on her career as an architect, a job she had always been passionate about. She had poured herself into her projects, the long hours at the office acting as a distraction from the gnawing emptiness at home. It was easier to be busy, to focus on something tangible, than to dwell on the unanswered questions that swirled around Jack's disappearance. Her family and friends were supportive, though they didn't fully understand the depth of her grief. After all, it wasn't as if Jack had died. He had simply vanished. The police had told her not to give up hope, but deep down, Emily had realized that she was clinging to something that might never return. The uncertainty was the worst part, the not knowing if he was alive, or if he had chosen to disappear for reasons she would never understand. In the years following his disappearance, there were days when she felt as though she were living in a limbo, trapped between the past and the present, unsure of how to reconcile the two. It wasn't until a few years later that she met Mark. He was a gentle soul, someone who seemed to understand that Emily's heart was a complicated place. Mark didn't try to replace Jack. He simply allowed her to be who she was, scars and all. In the beginning, their relationship was slow and cautious. Emily was hesitant to let anyone into her heart again, afraid of the vulnerability that came with love. But Mark never pushed her. And over time, he showed her what it meant to be loved without conditions, without the shadow of her past hanging over them. Mark was steady, reliable, and patient. He knew about Jack, of course, and he never tried to make Emily feel as though she needed to forget her former life. There was no judgment in his eyes, no expectation that she should somehow erase the man who had once meant everything to her. Mark simply accepted her, as she was, with all the complexities of her heart. They began dating casually, but as the months went by, Emily found herself drawn to him more and more. There was a comfort in their relationship that she hadn't known in years. Mark didn't expect Emily to fill any void that Jack had left behind. He simply offered her a space to heal, to breathe, and to rediscover herself. Eventually, Emily realized that she was ready to love again, ready to allow someone into her life in a way that felt whole, without constantly comparing him to Jack. Mark proposed to her on a quiet summer evening in their backyard, in the place where they had spent so many evenings together, talking, laughing, and sharing their dreams for the future. It wasn't a grand, dramatic proposal. It was simple and sincere, much like their relationship. Emily said yes without hesitation, her heart swelling with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She was ready for the next chapter of her life, but there was still a small part of her that held on to Jack, a part that she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. Their wedding was a modest affair, held in a small church on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the extravagant celebration that Emily had once dreamed of when she had first imagined marrying Jack, but it felt right. Mark was her present and her future. She could see the life they were building together, the family they would create, and it filled her with hope. She had found happiness again, or at least she was on the path to it. But even as she walked down the aisle toward Mark, Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of Jack's absence in her heart. Years went by, and Emily and Mark settled into a comfortable rhythm. They bought a house in the suburbs, where Emily's design work flourished, and Mark opened a small business. Together they built a life that was fulfilling in its own way. But still the absence of Jack lingered. It wasn't something that Emily often thought about, but there were moments, quiet, still moments, when she would catch herself wondering about him. Did he ever think about her? Was he alive? Was he out there somewhere, still living his life? Or had something terrible happened to him that she would never know? Mark and Emily had 2 children, a boy named Henry and a girl named Grace. Their arrival was a source of joy and wonder, and they brought a new sense of purpose to Emily's life. She focused on her children, on being the best mother she could be. But there were days when the questions about Jack resurfaced, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Every time the anniversary of their wedding approached, Emily would find herself lost in thought, remembering the day they had exchanged vows, the promises they had made to each other. She would catch herself wondering if Jack had ever regretted leaving her, if he ever thought about the life they could have had together. Emily tried not to dwell on the past, and for the most part she succeeded. She was too busy with her family and her work to allow herself to be consumed by the questions that still haunted her. But the pain of not knowing, of never having closure, was something she would never fully escape. It was a part of her life, woven into the fabric of who she was. And as the years went on, it became clear that while she had built a new life, Jack's absence was a part of her that she would always carry with her. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the children were asleep, Emily would think about the man she had married, the man who had promised to love her forever, and the man who had simply disappeared from her life. She would wonder if he was happy, if he had found peace, or if he was still searching for something that had eluded him. She had accepted that she might never have the answers, but that didn't make the not knowing any easier. Time had passed, and Emily had learned to live with the uncertainty. She had built a new life with Mark and their children, and in many ways, it was everything she had ever hoped for. But there were times, usually in the stillness of the night, when Jack's face would flash in her mind, and she would feel a pang of longing for the life they could have had. She would wonder if he had ever regretted leaving her, or if he had forgotten about her entirely. It was a thought she couldn't push away, no matter how hard she tried. As the years stretched on, the pain of Jack's disappearance had dulled, but it had never fully healed. Emily had learned to live with it, to make peace with the fact that some questions might never be answered. She had learned to love again, to build a new future, and to embrace the family she had created with Mark. But Jack would always be a part of her, an unresolved chapter in the story of her life, a story that had been marked by love, loss, and the enduring search for answers. And yet, as time went on, Emily couldn't help but wonder, what if one day the answers she had been searching for would finally come? What if, after all these years, she would get the closure she so desperately needed? It was a thought that had never quite left her mind, lingering at the edges of her consciousness, as she navigated the complexities of her new life. It had been a regular Thursday evening when the knock came. Emily was in the kitchen preparing dinner for her family, a task she had grown accustomed to over the years. The smell of roasted vegetables and garlic filled the house, mingling with the faint hum of the dishwasher in the background. Her two children, Henry and Grace, were in the living room, bickering over a board game, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of playful arguments. Mark, her husband, was due home from work any minute, and the evening was shaping up to be nothing out of the ordinary. She was in the middle of chopping carrots when she heard it. Just a single firm knock at the front door. It was an odd time for a visitor, she thought, glancing at the clock on the wall. Who could be calling at this hour? Her mind immediately began to race. She considered a few possibilities. Perhaps one of the neighbors had dropped by, or maybe it was a delivery. But something about the sound of the knock didn't feel routine. It was almost insistent, as though someone was waiting for an answer. Emily wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked toward the door. Her curiosity piqued. She peeked through the peephole, but didn't see anyone right away. It was dark outside, and the shadows of the evening obscured most of the yard. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Something told her that she wasn't about to open the door to something ordinary, something trivial. She took a deep breath and opened the door. Standing in front of her was a man, tall, with dark hair and a strong build. His clothes were simple, yet well-fitting, jeans and a leather jacket. There was something familiar about his features, something that tugged at her memory, but she couldn't place it. His expression was serious, yet there was an unmistakable tension in his eyes, as though he wasn't sure whether to expect a warm welcome or an immediate rejection. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Hello, Emily," the man said quietly, his voice a little hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in a long time. The words felt like a punch to her chest, and for a moment, Emily stood frozen, unable to speak. The world around her seemed to blur and tilt as if the ground beneath her had been pulled out from under her. Her heart pounded in her ears as she stared at the man in front of her, trying to make sense of the situation. The words he had spoken, her name, echoed in her mind, and the recognition came crashing in like a wave. It was a recognition that she didn't want, didn't expect, and certainly didn't know how to handle. "Jack." Her voice trembled as she finally managed to speak, her eyes wide in disbelief. The man nodded slowly, a mix of sadness and guilt passing over his face. His expression softened, but there was no mistaking the weight of the years that had passed between them. "Jack," Emily repeated, this time in a whisper, as if saying his name out loud might shatter the fragile bubble of reality she had built for herself over the years. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with the weight of so many unanswered questions hovering between them. She stepped back instinctively, her mind racing to process the impossible truth that stood on her doorstep. She was staring at the man who had disappeared from her life, without warning, without explanation, 15 years ago, on the very day they had gotten married. The man who had shattered her world and left her wondering if she would ever find peace again. And here he was, standing in front of her, looking almost the same as he had when he left, except there were shadows in his eyes, signs of years of suffering, and a weariness in his posture that spoke volumes. "Jack, what happened to you?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile moment and send him away again. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering to the floor as if searching for the right words, but he finally looked up at her, his expression serious. "I owe you an explanation, and I know there's nothing I can say to make up for what I did, but I need you to understand." She blinked, trying to make sense of his words, her breath caught in her throat. She stepped aside, her legs shaking, and gestured for him to come inside. She didn't know why she did it. Perhaps it was out of sheer shock. Or perhaps it was because she had spent so many years wondering what had happened to him. The door clicked shut behind them, and the quiet of the house suddenly felt suffocating. "Sit down," Emily said, her voice shaky but insistent. "Please. Just sit." Jack obeyed without a word, sitting down on the couch as Emily stood across from him, her hands gripping the back of a chair, as she tried to steady herself. Her mind was racing. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Her life had moved on. She had a family, a husband, children who adored her. She had built a new life. One that didn't include Jack. One that had to forget the man who had left her broken and confused. And yet, here he was, sitting in front of her, asking for a chance to explain. "Why didn't you come back?" Emily's voice cracked as she asked the question that had haunted her for so many years. The question that had never left her mind, no matter how much she tried to bury it. "Why didn't you? Why didn't you tell me what happened? Why did you just disappear?" Jack sighed deeply, his eyes lowering again. "It wasn't my choice. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I had no other option." Emily felt a pang of frustration mixed with disbelief. "What are you talking about? No option? You just left me. You vanished without a word." He nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "It's not as simple as that. After our wedding, something happened. Something I couldn't control. I was involved with some people I shouldn't have trusted. And they forced me into a situation I didn't know how to get out of." Emily was silent, her mind whirling. "Involved with people? Jack, what are you saying?" He looked pained, but he continued. "I was working for a company that was dealing with some pretty shady people. I didn't know the extent of it at first. I thought it was just a normal business deal. But soon I realized that they were using me. I was trapped. They blackmailed me into doing things I couldn't get out of. And when I tried to leave, when I tried to walk away, they took me." Emily shook her head, the pieces of the story not quite fitting together. "Taken? What do you mean taken? You could have called the police. You could have." "I couldn't." Jack cut in, his voice sharp with urgency. "They were watching me. They knew everything. If I had gone to the authorities, they would have hurt you. They would have found a way to hurt you, and everyone I cared about. So I had to leave. I had to disappear. I had to make it look like I was gone for good, so they wouldn't come after you." His words hit Emily like a wave, but they didn't fully sink in. Her mind was struggling to catch up. "You just disappeared? You didn't leave me a note, a message, nothing? You didn't think I deserved to know what was happening?" "I thought about you every single day," Jack said, his voice low, full of regret. "I thought about you all the time. But I couldn't risk it. If I had contacted you, if I had even left a trace, they would have found out. And they would have hurt you. I couldn't let that happen." Emily stood in silence for a long time, processing what he had said. It sounded like a twisted, impossible story, but she could see the sincerity in his eyes. She wanted to believe him, but there was so much pain, so much loss in the years he had taken from her. "You have to understand," Jack continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to leave you. But I had no choice. I was in over my head." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. 15 years of pain, confusion, and unanswered questions were flooding back all at once. She didn't know how to process it. She didn't know if she could forgive him. "Where were you?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "Where did you go? What happened after that?" Jack swallowed hard, a deep sadness in his eyes. "I was held captive for years. I wasn't allowed to leave, not until I found a way to escape. And when I finally did, I had nothing left. No identity, no money. I couldn't come back to you right away. I had to wait until I was safe." Emily sat down slowly, her hands in her lap, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she could ever understand what Jack had gone through. But a part of her wanted to. A part of her wanted to believe that everything he had said was true. And then, as if on cue, the sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway echoed through the quiet house. Emily froze, her eyes wide with panic. The truth she had just begun to accept. Jack was back. Jack was real. was about to collide with the life she had rebuilt. The sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway echoed through the house like a gunshot, snapping Emily back into the present. She felt the world shift beneath her feet, as if the fragile reality she had just begun to accept was now on the verge of crumbling. The man sitting in her living room, the man she had once promised to love forever, was back. Jack, the man who had disappeared without a trace, the man who had shattered her heart and left her with nothing but questions, was sitting in front of her, asking for a chance to explain. But Mark was coming home. Mark, the man who had been her anchor through the years, the man who had patiently loved her through her pain, was about to walk into a situation that she couldn't possibly explain. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She couldn't imagine what Mark would think, how he would react when he saw Jack sitting there, so suddenly, so inexplicably back in her life. "Jack, you have to leave," Emily whispered, her voice shaky with a mixture of fear and desperation. She could feel the walls closing in on her. The choice she had been avoiding, the impossible decision, was now thrust upon her. Jack had come back, but Mark was here too. She didn't know how to navigate this storm that had just entered her life. She had built a new world, one with Mark, one with stability and safety. And yet, the presence of Jack, his explanation, his pain, the unresolved history between them, demanded to be acknowledged. She couldn't ignore it, but she couldn't hurt Mark either. "I know this is a lot," Jack said, his voice soft but firm. He stood up slowly, his eyes locked on Emily's with an intensity that made her heart ache. "But please, I need you to understand. I didn't want to disappear. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't have a choice." "I know," Emily said, her voice breaking as she looked at him. "But Jack, you were gone for 15 years. 15 years, and now you're just back?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a wave of frustration sweeping over her. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle this. You weren't supposed to come back." Jack's face softened, and he took a cautious step toward her. "I know it's a lot to process. I didn't expect to just walk in and have everything be okay. But I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to know that I didn't choose to leave you. I was forced to." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the sound of the front door opening and closing reverberated through the house. Mark's voice echoed from the hallway, calling out, "Em? I'm home." Her heart stopped. She turned to face Jack, her mind racing, her body trembling. The weight of what was about to happen was unbearable. She couldn't hide this from Mark, not after all these years. But how could she explain it? How could she tell him that her past, the past she had buried so deeply, had come crashing back into their lives? "I have to go," Jack said suddenly, his voice tinged with sadness. He looked at Emily one last time, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't want to cause any more problems. I just wanted you to know the truth. I'll leave, and I won't bother you again." "Jack." Emily's voice faltered as she reached out to him. 1,000 emotions collided in her chest. Confusion, anger, pain, and a deep, unrelenting sadness. She couldn't let him go like this. She couldn't let him disappear again. Not without understanding everything. Not without confronting the past that had been left unresolved for so long. But before she could say anything more, Mark stepped into the room. Emily froze, her heart racing. She turned toward Mark, her mind desperately scrambling for the right words. For an explanation. For something to make this make sense. She knew there was no easy way to explain the impossible. But Mark was standing there, looking at her with a mixture of confusion and concern. And she knew there was no turning back. "Emily," Mark said, his voice gentle but filled with uncertainty. "Who's this?" Jack stood up straight, his posture defensive, his eyes flickering between Emily and Mark. He didn't say anything, but the tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken questions. Emily took a deep breath, her hands still trembling, as she held on to the chair behind her for support. She felt like the ground beneath her was slipping away, and for the first time in years, she didn't know what to do. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her, and she knew there was no avoiding it. She had to confront the past. She had to make a decision. "Mark, this is Jack," Emily began, her voice barely above a whisper. She paused, struggling to find the right words. "Jack was my husband. 15 years ago. He disappeared after our wedding. I didn't know where he went, or why he left. I spent years trying to understand what happened to him, but now he's here and he says he didn't leave me on purpose. He says he was forced to disappear. Mark's expression shifted from confusion to something else, something darker, a mix of hurt and disbelief. What? He asked, his voice strained. You're telling me this is the same Jack? The one who just left you without a word? Yes, Emily said, her throat tight. This is him. But he didn't leave me by choice. There were circumstances. I need you to understand that. Mark stood frozen for a moment, his gaze flickering between Emily and Jack, his fists clenching at his sides. You've been living with this secret all this time? He asked, his voice barely controlled. All these years, and you never told me about him? Emily's heart shattered at the accusation, but she knew it was deserved. She had never told Mark the whole truth, never explained the depths of her past. She had kept Jack locked away in a part of her heart that she had hoped would stay buried forever. I didn't know how to tell you, Emily said, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to explain what happened. I didn't know how to explain why I still thought about him. Why he was still a part of my life, even though he wasn't here. Mark looked at her for a long moment, his face a mixture of confusion, hurt, and disbelief. I thought we had a life together, Emily. I thought we had built something solid. But now you're telling me that I've been living in the shadow of this man. This ghost from your past? And you never said anything? I'm sorry, Emily said, her voice breaking. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to keep secrets from you. But I couldn't erase Jack from my past. He's part of me, no matter how much I tried to move on. I've tried to build a life with you, Mark. A life with us, with our family. But Jack has been a part of that too. I never meant for it to be this way. Mark's face softened for a moment, his eyes searching hers. But then, as quickly as the softness appeared, it disappeared, replaced by a cold, hard expression. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I need some time, he said quietly, his voice tight. I need to think. I need to process all of this. This isn't something I can just... I don't know. I don't know how to deal with this, Emily. Before she could respond, Mark turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy on the floor as he left her standing there, torn between the past and the present. Jack was still standing in the corner of the room, watching, his face a mask of uncertainty and regret. Emily felt her heart shatter once more. But this time it was different. She had spent so many years living in the shadow of Jack's disappearance, building a life with Mark, trying to move on. Now, everything was crumbling, and she didn't know how to fix it. She turned to Jack, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to do, she whispered. I don't know if I can fix this. I don't know if I can fix us. Jack walked over to her slowly, his hand hovering, as though he wasn't sure if he should reach out. He didn't. He simply looked at her with a mixture of guilt and understanding. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I never meant for things to turn out like this. I never meant for you to suffer. I know I've hurt you, and I can never take that back. But please, Emily, know that I never wanted to leave you. I never wanted any of this. She nodded slowly, her heart aching. I don't know if I can forgive you, Jack. But I'm not the same person I was when you left. I've changed. We've all changed. Jack nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. I understand. And whatever happens, I'll respect your decision. I just needed you to know the truth. As Emily stood there, caught between the two men who had shaped her life in such different ways, she knew that her decision would change everything. There were no easy answers, no simple resolutions. She had spent so many years trying to forget Jack, trying to move forward, but now he was back. And Mark, her partner, her husband, was reeling from the revelation of a past she had kept hidden for so long. She took a deep breath, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult, that the choices she made now would determine the future of her family, her heart, and her life. But whatever happened, Emily knew one thing for certain. She couldn't go back to the life she had before. Too much had changed. She had to find a way forward, one way or another. And she had to do it alone. Jack left that evening, respecting her need for space, and Mark stayed away for days, giving her the time to think. Eventually, after weeks of turmoil and soul-searching, Emily knew that her future lay with the family she had built with Mark. Jack had been a part of her life, a chapter that she could never erase, But Mark was the man who had helped her heal. And in the end, Emily chose the man who had been there for her all along. The past, while painful, would remain where it belonged, in the past. The future, however, was waiting for her to embrace it.